Alrighty. Good morning, good morning, good morning, and happy Sabbath. We are back. It's very, very good to see everybody here. It's very, very good to be part of this. I'm really excited to get back into the swing of things and keep things going. I do know that at least in California, things may be changing. The schedule may be changing slightly, but we shall see. I don't really have any updates for anybody on that. If you are new here, welcome, welcome, welcome. It's very, very good to see you guys. Hopefully putting out some new stuff, some really awesome stuff that I'm really hoping that you guys will enjoy. I'm looking at putting out a new series, as well as doing some more music in the future. So yes, I'm hopefully, so we're going to be seeing some new stuff here hopefully very, very soon. That being said, if you are new here, if you want to check out some of the stuff, my YouTube channel, my Facebook page, both have archived videos that you can watch, archived streams and things like that. So please do check that out. Really, really, really looking forward to that. I'm going to go ahead and open up with a word of prayer, and we will dive right on in. So I'm really, like I said, really looking forward to this. If you have questions at any point or comments or anything like that, please do feel free to leave them in the chat. If you are watching via the recorded video, please feel free to leave any comments or questions in the comment section. I would be more than happy to answer that as best as I am able. So that being said, let's go ahead and open up with a word of prayer, and we will dive right on in. So let's bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for everything that you have done. Thank you for your grace. Thank you for your love and mercy. And thank you most of all for Jesus and for everything that he has done for us. I ask that you would please fill us with your Spirit now, that you would anoint us with your grace, and that above all else, he would be lifted up, that you would speak, and that you would bring people who need to hear. Thank you. Amen. Alrighty. I do want to say that that I am going to be getting a lot of my information from this book. This is Green Pharmacy by Barbara Griggs. This is a very, very, very even started before school even started. It's such a good book, and it's very thorough. Even though it says that it's a history and evolution of Western herbal medicine, it actually covers basically just the history of medicine. It covers both, yes, herbal medicine, but also regular medicine and how they interacted with each other and how the interactions really developed the modern philosophy of how the modern philosophy of medicine developed, and also how herbalism today may differ from the herbalism of a few years ago, or a few centuries ago, and kind of the basic principles of how things work. And it's a regular law that was passed in England during the 16th century, and this was just so amazing. It's just completely astonishing, and that, of course, is really, really interesting, and it's actually the foundation for the laws even today of that the United Kingdom has for herbalism. It's really, really interesting that it's so effective that my goodness, I mean, or it was so influential, rather, not so much effective. Amazing. Now, to give some background here, this is still the beginning of the 16th century. The 16th century, of course, was an incredibly tumultuous time period. This was when the Reformation had begun. This was when there was a lot of political strife, there was a lot of religious strife, there was a lot of social agitation, especially in the what was formerly known as the Holy Roman Empire, which was basically Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Prussia, and some other places. So it's quite the significant chunk of, and I think also Czechoslovakia and some other Baltic and Slavic countries. But I could be wrong on that. It's been a while since I've looked at the geography of the Holy Roman Empire. But You also had France with its situations that were going on. You had some of the, it was really, really a very, very nasty situation. France and England had been out of war for about 100 years at this point, almost anyway, after the 100 Years' War that had started in the late 14th century and ended in the 15th century. And on top of that, the how can I say this? On top of that, you also had the Wars of the Roses that had just taken place. Henry VIII, his father Henry VII, had been the victor of the Wars of the Roses in England, and of course you'd also had John Wycliffe and some of these others as well, the Lollards, these people who were considered heretics of the church, and they were a heavily persecuted group. There were all sorts of things that were going on at this particular time. The Lollards now in the 16th century were not as prevalent or as out there. They were still there, if I, remember right. They were still there, but they weren't as much on the public mind as before. Now, I'm going to really quickly, I apologize here. All right, sorry about that. So, yeah, this was a very, very tumultuous time as far as, how can I say it? As far as, well, everything. This was a very tumultuous time. And of course, Henry VIII, one of the most controversy-inspiring monarchs to ever rule on the throne of England, has risen to power. He was born in 1491, and he just, lots of problems. He had just, his family had only just risen to power. This was a very, very, very interesting time period. And Henry VIII had one thing that above all else irked many people around him, other than his exploits with women. That and the racing. He loved horse racing. But other than those things, one of the things that irked many people around him was his real dislike for conventional medicine, the conventional medicine of the day. Of course, the conventional medicine of the day was heavily influenced by astrology. It was heavily influenced by Galenic medicine and humoral theory. That is the idea that the body is composed of 4 humors: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm, and that a balance of those is what helps the Paracelsus rise up, who actually we talked about a couple weeks ago. He was a very, very influential man in kind of disputing Galenic medicine and looking at also even disputing humoral theory and just relying on simple herbs and yes, he did use mercury and some other mineral therapies as well because he was an alchemist. However, his basic concepts, Paracelsus' basic concepts of simple treatments and using an herb or a treatment that actually directly applies to the disease rather than, well, theoretically should apply to the disease because of its supposed Galenic classifications, it was very, very different and much better. Now, the Quacks Charter here, that we're looking at that, and the in King's King, just to kind of get again still going at the background here. Henry VIII was, how can I say this? He was a very, very interesting person. And see, the thing is, like many kings in his day, he didn't just rely on a physician to make medicine for him. He dabbled in medicine himself. This was something that was apparently quite common for people of his day and age, kings of his day and age, to dabble in. And he used all sorts of different simple herbs and simple things like that. He did rely on, how can I say it? He did rely on herbs that a little bit more than your average physician would, but most of his remedies, most of his herbs were herbs that were used. How can I say this? Most of his herbs were herbs that were used for your common everyday things you pretty much every housewife would have known. And most people indeed did do this, but Henry really dabbled in it because he found it fun to kind of make these concoctions and do things like that. Now, that being said, there were some things that he was a little iffy about, but that's because, again, it was the medicine of his day, using things like powdered coral or turpentine or silver, which, some of it I could see. But he would also use things that, such as unicorn horn, which is probably just rhinoceros horn. And there were other animal substances as well that he would have used. This was fairly common in medicine of the day. You would use everything from so-called unicorn horn to, boiled toads and things like that. This was not uncommon. And of course, if you look at the time period a little bit later on in Elizabeth, in Henry's daughter Elizabeth's reign, with Shakespeare, Shakespeare wrote a great deal of herbal knowledge into his plays, and there's just all sorts of really interesting things in there. But there were, how can I say this? There were a lot of treatises and other things like that out there, herbals and such, that were used either for your common folk and also for physicians. There were a lot of them that were written specifically for physicians. They were what would today be known as pharmacology, was back then known as materia medica, and even up as late as the 19th century, it was materia medica. And I do apologize, I have to do this again. The only time of year that I have allergies. Okay. So these herbals were actually relatively common. You had herbals of all sorts that were being put out at this time period, and actually, again, you can find this in elsewhere, not just in England. In Germany, there were a great number of herbals that were being put out. Paracelsus actually was very much against many of them because he felt that they were steeped in the strange theories of the schoolmen and didn't really have much in the way of decent, herbal use in them. In fact, Paracelsus felt that these herbals and these things were detracting from or reducing the available knowledge of herbs that could be used. He felt that there were, that most of the herbals were not actually giving the herbs a fair treatment. This is very, very interesting, and how can I say this? There was a lot of, and these herbals were of basically the same character. There were a great number of herbals that were published in England, most of which were for, as I said, the consumption of physicians. but there were plenty also that were being used by your everyday person, your everyday, especially housewife. Something of note, actually, was that for quite some time, medicine was not just something that was relegated to the physicians. You had, and I believe I covered this on the first time that the first stream that we did on this topic. Medicine was not just limited to the physicians. There was the physician who would formulate and compound medicine the way that they saw fit. You had the apothecary, who was not unlike the modern pharmacist or chemist, depending on what part of the world you're in. But the apothecary would also diagnose, so it was another kind of physician, sort of, but it wasn't classified as a physician. And then you had your folk healers, or your village healer, who would be kind of right up there with, who would use a totally different system of medicine. Instead of relying on Galenic medicine or exotic herbs or exotic minerals and things like that, the folk healer, usually the village wise woman, would use herbs in a way that was, how shall I say it, practical. It was very much relying on folk traditions and things that had been passed down from generation to generation. And then below that, you had your everyday housewife, who was pretty much your home's healer. When she couldn't do anything, then you would turn to the village folk healer. And if they couldn't do anything, which was very rare, or if you lived in a city and you didn't have a village folk healer, then you would turn to the physicians. Of course, the physicians or the apothecaries would charge exorbitant amounts of money because, well, they needed to. The herbs, the medicines, and such that they were using at that time were incredibly expensive, especially when you went to an apothecary. Apothecaries would compound 50, 60, 70 herbs all in one little boiling pot. To be fair, that's the way that a lot of the peasants cooked, was you just kept throwing things in a pot and just let it cook day in, day out, day in, day out. They made medicine the same way. They would throw all these different things, and sometimes they would even age them like wine. It's a very, very nasty process, and of course many of those ingredients were exotic from places as far away as Arabia or even India. You would have these different exotic ingredients, and of course later on, now in the 16th century, you also had stuff coming over from the Americas as well, and especially guaiac, which was a very, very common herb that was used at this time, especially to treat syphilis. And so guaiac, along with mercury, those were the two big things. Now, those were really what were coming over from the Americas, but those were expensive to import. And so many of these herbs, many of these treatments were things that cost a lot of money. And so in order for the physicians to make a living, in order for the apothecaries to make a living, they had to charge rather high prices. But that being said, they did also charge even higher than they needed to. Unlike the village folk healer, who pretty much only charged what they needed to survive, which, it wasn't that much because they could just go out and get it from, the fields and the forests, which, again, very, very different. And so this really had a strong impact on the division of medicine in these days. However, I will say that herbalism and modern medicine at that time I should say, herbalism and what was then modern medicine, the physicians' work and the apothecaries, they weren't as far distant as they would be today. However, the relationship between the apothecaries and or pharmacists and physicians is much better today than it was before. you had you have now a very much stronger relationship between those two. Before, they were competitors. Now the physician can only prescribe, while the can only diagnose and prescribe. The apothecary can only, or not the apothecary, the physician, no, let me speak. Let me get the right words here. The pharmacist or chemist can only formulate and administer uh, based on what the physician has prescribed. And so there's a very real, at least that's the way it is in America. I am not familiar with the way it is in other parts of the world. Um, that being said, how can I say this? There was still, in the 16th century, a much more heated relationship between these three. However, the apothecaries were still much better tolerated by the physicians than were the folk healers. The reason being that the folk healers completely disregarded everything that the regular physicians had ever learned. The regular physicians learned Galenic theory, Galenic classifications, humoral theory, and a lot of those other things and classifications of all sorts of herbs and everything like that. And the apothecaries did too. The folk healers just kind of ignored all that and just administered herbs based on the idea that, well, if it works, then I'll give it. If it doesn't work, then I won't give it. And that, of course, was anathema to physicians in those days, because you had certain theories that needed to be upheld. And ultimately, this boiled down to professional snobbery and a traditionalism, which was very much something that, unfortunately, pervaded most of Europe at that time. This, of course, was the same basic idea that the Reformation had originally brought out at this same time, where you had, hey, you know what, these traditions, these things that we're doing, maybe they're not right. And this same questioning spirit really began to rise up in the field of medicine as well. Once again, a couple weeks ago, we looked at Paracelsus. Around the same time, he started to do that. Henry VIII also began to really look at this, and it's really fascinating to see just how much influence the folk healer, the so-called quacks and charlatans or amateurs. Of course, all three of those names were the names given to them by regular physicians, or your basic physicians. These people were were classified as such because they had almost no school training. The training, the length of the training of your average physician was goodness, almost as long as it is today. In fact, your average physician was 32 before he completed his work. No, excuse me. My apologies. Once again, I am referencing a lot from this book. So, no, I misread that. Henry VIII's personal physician was 13 years. In fact, the full degree or course, here we go, this is what I was looking for. The full medical degree course lasted a full 14 years. Now, of course, 10 years is more like what we're looking at. 8 to 10 years is more like what your average physician would look at today for school. 8 to 10 years. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you can get it done a little bit shorter. Sometimes it may take a little longer than that. But in this case, 14 years. That's a long time. And of course, when you go to school for that period of time, you have... I like this quote here. Perhaps at no time in history had the physician's training been so completely theoretical. In other words, it was based entirely on ideas and concepts and had basically no foundation whatsoever in actual practical investigation. Studies, such as we do now, peer-reviewed studies and things like that on the effectiveness of medicines, were not performed. Medicines were graded on their effectiveness not by virtue of how they actually performed in the real world, but by virtue of how they were categorized and in what category the disease was upon which the medicine was supposed to be used. This, of course, was totally theoretical, had almost no foundation in reality, and you thought, because the idea was that we have to keep our humors in balance, we need to let out some blood because over the wintertime we make too much blood, or over the period of time we make bad blood, or something like that. Of course, that's complete hogwash. The idea, but at the same time, they didn't know that. And so, or they refused to consider the possibility that it might be wrong because nobody had ever questioned it. Same, again, the same spirit that had pervaded religion also pervaded medicine. And this was something that now was going to be called out, now was going to be questioned and really brought into determination. And Henry VIII really had a major effect on this. Even before his whole situation with the Catholic Church and wanting a divorce, and then not divorcing himself not only from his wife, but also from the Catholic Church, he had begun to really look at the so-called quacks, the amateurs, who were, the folk physicians, the folk medicines, the folk healers of England in particular. And he really kind of let them do whatever they wanted to do. He gave them a lot of leeway, and as a result, they became major competition for your expensive physicians because, well, first of all, they worked, and second of all, they were significantly cheaper and significantly more available than your doctors that were in the big cities. And so, because, if all your people are getting better without coming to you, where's your money going to come from? And, how are you going to live? Now, of course, the proper thing to do would have been to examine the perspective of medicine at that time and say, hey, is this actually right? Or do we need to rethink things? But of course, that was not what most physicians did. Most physicians and spoke out against it. In fact, one quote here says, "For now, say they, every man without any study of necessary arts unto the knowledge of physic will become a physician. Every man, nay, every old wife will presume, not without the mortar of many, to practice physic." Now, of course, this is, again, a physician speaking who is claiming that folk medicine kills a bunch of people, which is really a load of nonsense. Sure, there would have been fatalities, mortalities, and things, but none more than at the hands of the regular physicians. But they classified it as, oh, well, it's just a failure of this person's system, rather than pointing out that, oh, actually, it was the medicines that we were giving. And this actually continued on all the way up until the 19th century, and even the early 20th century as well. And so you really had this this divide that was going on. You had the amateurs who were just now getting a hold of medicine and of folk medicine, of folk healing, and you had the you had the folk healers themselves, who I believe were probably pretty happy about the fact that stuff was getting out there, because they weren't in it for money, they weren't in it for really livelihood even. They were in it more because they, well, first of all, because that was their trade, and also because, generally speaking, they wanted people to get better. And so, now again, not to put down any individuals or any physicians that were in that, any physicians at that time, I'm speaking generally of the system. There were some physicians who were not the most scrupulous of people, but you also had some really interesting situations come up as well. Even more competitions were going out, were coming up for your physicians. You had surgeons who had begun to do internal medicine as well. this was very, very interesting, and this was something that a lot of people had, or had been great many strides in surgery and in the practice of surgery, and even in internal medicine, that the surgeons were growing in ability. On top of that, you had also barber surgeons, people who were barbers but who also performed surgery. And this is actually, interestingly enough, where the barbershop pole came from. You had blue and red and white. Yeah, that meant you were a barber, right? We think about cupping, bleeding, tooth extraction, surgery, etc. Those things were practiced. Really interestingly enough, the common folk were the ones who, even though they were, and it depends on where you were too. In England, it was you would have had something like a folk healer. You would have had a village wise woman or something. Blacksmiths were very much associated with healing and such in Wales at the time. At least, if that than me, then please do let me know. But of course, the blacksmith working with fire, cauterizing wounds and things like that was very much something that was possible. But there was also an association of the blacksmithing art with your average, with healing. And so these people, very interestingly, here's a quote from this is a preamble in in the College of Physicians. It's a letter that kind of put out a physician's college here, and he says that these people, these regular practitioners, these common folk, he calls them a great multitude of ignorant, so far forth that common artificers, smiths, weavers, and women boldly and accustomably took upon them great cures to the high displeasure of God, great infamy of the faculty, and the grievous hurt, damage, and destruction of many of the king's liege people. Of course, these people were anything but anything if not effective. These regular folks were, well, they were good at what they did. They were better than the physicians were, usually. However, Henry VIII was not happy with how these folk healers were being portrayed. And he, along with Cardinal Wolsey, or his minister Wolsey, oh no, excuse me. Legislation that would help, let's see here. Yeah, it would help people to call upon medical aid appropriately, at least according to the way that the physicians termed medical aid. And so this was something that there was, the College of Physicians was set up. There were other bits of legislation that were passed. However, contrary to what the physicians wanted, King Henry VIII snuck in something very, very significant. In fact, in the act itself, there is a very big speaking up against the surgeons and other people who have not much knowledge, who were really putting down these people who were, the folk healers and things like that. Very, very interesting. In the act, it says, vexed diverse honest persons, as well men as women, whom God hath endued with the knowledge of nature, kind and operation of certain herbs, roots, and waters, and the using and ministering of them, to such as has been pained with customable diseases, as women's breasts being sore, a pin and the web in the eye, uncommon of hands, scaldings, burnings, sore mouths, the stone, strangury, and so on. It lists a bunch of them, and basically says that these people have been suffering as a result of what has been done to them by the surgeons. But then it goes on to make a very, very significant provision, and it says here, it shall be lawful to every person being the king's subject, so everyone who is a subject of the King of England. So anybody who was in the United Kingdom, except Scotland, I don't think was part of it at the time. It shall be lawful to every person being the king's subject, having to use and minister in and to any outward sore, uncome, wound, apostemations, outward swelling or disease, any herb or herbs, ointments, baths, poultices, and emplasters, according to their cunning, experience, and knowledge in any of the diseases, sores, maladies before said, and all other like to the same, or to drinks for the stone and strangury, or eggs, without suit, vexation, trouble, penalty, or loss of their goods. In other words, physicians, you wanted to make sure that you were the only ones who could practice medicine? Actually, everybody gets to practice medicine now, according to their knowledge. If they have any knowledge of the way things work, of basic folk healing, they can do it if they want to. And you can't do a thing about it, which is really astonishing and really, really interesting. The final words of this act, or to do anything with, to try and abuse or put down or discriminate against these new folk healers who were instigated. This is just phenomenal. It said, the foresaid statute in the foresaid third year of the king's most gracious reign, or any other act, ordinance, or statute to the contrary hereof, this protects them, and anything that you could have done before, yeah, that's gone. And of course, this was something that the regular physicians hated. They, in fact, they hated so much that they called this act the Quacks Charter. Because, of course, anybody who didn't listen to what they had to say must therefore be a quack. And now, I'll grant you, especially in today's day and age, not so much back then, but in today's day and age, yes, absolutely, there are a lot of myths and misunderstandings about how things work, what it once was. Allopathic medicine has grown immensely as far as its capacity to empirical evidence to back it up, which is phenomenal, and that's a huge improvement against these things. Now, it should be looked at in an isolated case, and that's just simply not the case. Or that the idea that medicine is what treats the disease, that's not actually the case either. It's the body that treats the disease, not the medicine. The medicine simply facilitates the body or aids the body in actually accomplishing what the body needs to do. Now, again, there are still some allopathic treatments and things like that, some regular, modern medical treatments that actually do fall under that category of helping the body to heal or helping the body to do what it needs to do. But that being said, there are still some problems with its overall philosophy, and it does need some tweaking, but it is much better than things were in those days. This is really, really incredible. Traditional medicine could be practiced in Henry VIII's England, and on top of that, this particular charter was almost strengthened, not so much by direct legislation, but by the acts of the crown in the reign of Elizabeth I. She was, how can I, where is that story? Actually a very interesting situation. A particular Margaret Kennicks, who was a folk healer, was accosted, basically. Now, she also, Elizabeth I was very, very well versed in medicine herself, and she also had as much of a seeing this woman who was being accosted by all these people. Elizabeth took a personal interest into the case, made sure that she looked carefully in the circumstances, and then she wrote, or rather she commissioned her Secretary of State to write to the physicians a statement that said it was Her Majesty's pleasure that the poor woman should be permitted by you quietly to practice and minister to the curing of diseases and wounds, by the means of certain simples and the application where amongst yourselves, for the readmitting of her into the quiet exercise of her small talent, lest by the renewing of her complaint to Her Majesty through your hard dealing towards her, in other words, if you pursue this further, if you do anything else to this woman and she complains to me again, you are going to inconvenience yourselves. There will be further inconvenience to you. In other words, yeah, don't do it, or there's going to be severe consequences for you. They wrote back. The college wrote back for basically saying that, well, they didn't agree with that. They were very upset about it, etc., etc., etc. Lots of hot air. They did end up. However, the College of Physicians eventually had to back down, or rather direct their focus somewhere else. And that was because herbs were no longer the tide of the day. Galenic medicine was failing significantly, and the Quacks Charter, as infuriating as it was to the 14 years schooled physicians, it was something that ultimately took a back seat because the basic fundamental theories that medicine had been based on for the better part of 1,000 years was now about to come crumbling down with the advent of chemical medicines or mineral medicines. These were things that were, how can I say this? Not classified at all by Galen, not dealt with at all by any of the former, they weren't dealt with at all by medical theory. Not at all. And now it was showing up, and it was becoming popular in the 17th century. And we will talk about that next week. So, again, I'm going to pause now and ask if there are any questions or comments at all. Please do go ahead and leave them in the comment section, or in the chat right now. I will open things up to that if there are any. And please do remember as well, while I'm waiting, or if are there any questions from the Zoom meeting? Okay. All right. All right. While we wait, I do want to say, if you want to know more about the history of medicine, please do check out the previous videos. You can find them on my YouTube channel and on my Facebook page as well. Again, that's The King's Bard. You can check that out. It's got a lot of stuff on there. Lots of sacred history episodes, all sorts of things like that. This, once again, Green Pharmacy. This is by Barbara Griggs. It's really, really a good book. It's probably the single best book that you can get on the history of medicine. It's incredible. For anybody who knows about the Great Controversy, which is a book about the Christian Church from after from the close of the New Testament all the way up, from basically from the 2nd century onwards, but kind of also covering a little bit of the 1st century. Onwards up until the 19th century when the book was written. This is basically that, but for medicine, and it's really, really, really fascinating. It's incredibly well written, it's well documented, lots of fantastic sources, and it's just well written, it's well done, plenty of references, but it's written in a way where it's not full of technical terms that you can't understand, and it's simple language, which is amazing. So please do check it out. It's really, really good. Again, Green Pharmacy by Barbara Griggs. It's just a fantastic, fantastic book. Alrighty. If there are no other questions or comments, then we can go ahead and cut it off here, or rather end it here. We do have our Bible study today at 11:15, so please do come on out for that series, but it is a segue into another series that we're going to be doing. It focuses on something else. What, you may ask? Well, you got to come to find out. It's at 11:15. I will be streaming that here, so please do check that out. Anyway, that being said, and also we are going to be having our Bardic session as well at 12:30, or around about that time, so please do join us for that as well. That being said, let's go ahead and close out with a word of prayer, and I will see you guys for your tenderness in everything that you do for us. Thank you, Lord, as well, that you have not left us in darkness or in ignorance about these things that have happened in the past. That I ask that you would help us to learn from these things, that we would grow in the knowledge to our lives. And I just ask that you would please prepare our hearts for your word right now, that we would be ready to study and to learn. Thank you so much. In the name of Jesus Christ, we pray and ask all these things. Amen. Alrighty.